The summer heat bore down relentlessly on Sagebrush Creek, Arizona territory, as the funeral procession made its slow, deliberate way toward the cemetery on the outskirts of town. The year was 1882, and the settlement, barely 15 years old, had already claimed its share of the dead. Most had succumbed to the harsh realities of frontier life, disease, mining accidents, or the occasional violent dispute that erupted in the saloon after too many glasses of whiskey. But James Sullivan's death had been different. The respected shopkeeper and former cavalry officer had been found in his bed 3 days prior, his face frozen in an expression that the town doctor, Edwin Harlow, had described as a most peculiar blend of terror and revelation. No marks of violence were visible on the body, no signs of illness had preceded his passing, and at 42 years of age, Sullivan had been considered a man in his prime. The widow, Eleanor Sullivan, walked directly behind the pine coffin, which featured an unusual glass viewing panel embedded in its lid, a luxury in these parts, specially ordered from Tucson at considerable expense. Through the glass, the face of the deceased was visible, meticulously prepared by Dr. Harlow, who had learned the emerging art of embalming during his service in the war between the states. James Sullivan's complexion had a waxy quality to it now, but the preservation work had been skillfully done, masking the haunting expression that had been present at the moment of discovery. "Never seen a coffin like that out here," whispered Hank Miller to his wife as they followed several paces behind. "Must have cost the widow a small fortune." "Hush now," Martha Miller replied, eyeing Eleanor Sullivan's rigid back. The widow's black mourning dress, ordered by catalog from San Francisco months earlier for social occasions, now served a grimmer purpose. "She can probably hear you." Eleanor Sullivan heard nothing. Her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts consumed by the events of the past week. To the onlookers, she was the very picture of a grieving widow, dignified, composed, and appropriately somber. No one could see the turmoil that raged beneath her carefully maintained exterior. Behind her walked her brother-in-law, Robert Sullivan, who had arrived from Denver just the previous evening. His face was a mask of grief, though those who knew him well might have detected something else in his eyes, a calculating sharpness that seemed at odds with the solemn occasion. Sheriff Thomas Ward observed the proceedings from the periphery, his weathered face betraying nothing of his thoughts. He had been troubled by certain aspects of James Sullivan's death, inconsistencies that nagged at him. But a man dying in his bed with no signs of foul play rarely warranted an investigation on the frontier, where death was an everyday companion. The procession reached the freshly dug grave as the local minister, Reverend Pearson, took his position at its head. The coffin was placed on 2 sturdy planks spanning the opening, its glass panel reflecting the harsh Arizona sunlight. "We are gathered here today to commit the body of our brother, James Edward Sullivan, to the earth from which we all come, and to which we all must return," the Reverend began, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the coffin, particularly on the glass panel. The summer sun struck it at an angle, creating a glare that obscured her husband's face from where she stood. Perhaps that was a mercy. "James Sullivan was a pillar of our community," Reverend Pearson continued, "a man of commerce and integrity, who served his country honorably before settling among us to help build this town from dusty streets and scattered buildings into a community of God-fearing citizens." As the eulogy continued, Sheriff Ward found his attention drawn to Eleanor Sullivan. There was something in her rigid posture that struck him as unusual, even for a grieving widow. Fear, perhaps? Or was it vigilance? He had known Eleanor for nearly 5 years, ever since the Sullivans had arrived in Sagebrush Creek. She had always struck him as a woman of remarkable composure and intelligence, qualities that had served her well as the wife of the town's most prominent shopkeeper. But today, there was something different about her. The service proceeded with Methodist hymns sung by the small choir from the church, their voices rising and falling in the still desert air. When it came time for the coffin to be lowered into the ground, Robert Sullivan stepped forward to assist the pallbearers. It was at that precise moment that Abigail Tanner, the 11-year-old daughter of the town blacksmith, let out a piercing scream that shattered the solemnity of the occasion. All eyes turned to the child, who was pointing at the coffin with a trembling finger. "His eyes!" she shrieked. "His eyes are open!" A murmur rippled through the gathering as people craned their necks to see. The position of the coffin had shifted during the preparation for lowering, changing the angle of the sunlight reflecting off the glass panel. And now, clearly visible to all, were the wide-open eyes of James Sullivan, staring up through the glass with an expression of undeniable horror. Dr. Harlow pushed his way forward. "Impossible," he muttered. "I closed them myself." Eleanor Sullivan swayed slightly but remained upright, her gloved hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Robert Sullivan placed a steadying hand on her arm, his expression unreadable. Sheriff Ward stepped closer to the coffin and leaned down to peer through the glass panel. What he saw sent a chill through him despite the blistering heat. Not only were James Sullivan's eyes open, but they seemed to be fixed on a specific point, directed not upward through the glass, but towards something in the coffin with him. "Continue with the burial," Eleanor Sullivan said suddenly, her voice cutting through the confused murmuring of the crowd. "It's just a trick of the light." Dr. Harlow shook his head. "Mrs. Sullivan, I assure you, I properly prepared the body. The eyes were closed. This is unusual." "It happens sometimes," Robert Sullivan interjected smoothly. "I've heard of it before. The movement of the coffin can cause the eyelids to open. Nothing supernatural about it." But Sheriff Ward had seen something else. Something that made his lawman's instincts come alive. Just visible at the edge of James Sullivan's collar was a small, dark mark that hadn't been there when he'd viewed the body at Sullivan's house 3 days ago. "Hold on," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of his position. "I'd like Dr. Harlow to check something before we proceed." A tense silence fell over the gathering as Dr. Harlow bent to look more closely through the glass panel. After a long moment, he straightened, his face pale beneath his sun-reddened complexion. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should move the coffin to my office for a brief examination before continuing with the burial." Eleanor Sullivan stepped forward. "This is outrageous. My husband is to be buried, not subjected to further indignities." "Mrs. Sullivan," Sheriff Ward said quietly, "I believe it's in everyone's best interest to be certain about what we're seeing here." Robert Sullivan's hand tightened on his sister-in-law's arm. "Eleanor," he murmured, "it might be best to allow this, to put everyone's minds at ease." For a moment it seemed she might refuse. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, she acquiesced. The pallbearers lifted the coffin once more, and the procession redirected itself toward Dr. Harlow's office on the main street of Sagebrush Creek. As they walked, Sheriff Ward fell into step beside Eleanor Sullivan. "I'm sorry for this disruption, ma'am," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "Are you, Sheriff? Or are you simply satisfying your curiosity?" "I'm doing my job, Mrs. Sullivan, making sure everything is as it should be." This time she did turn to him, and the look in her eyes made him take an involuntary step back. "Nothing is as it should be, Sheriff. My husband is dead." Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Subscribe now to uncover the dark secrets of America's past that history books don't dare reveal. Stories that will change how you see the very ground beneath your feet. Dr. Harlow's office was not designed to accommodate a crowd, so most of the funeral attendees remained outside, clustering in small groups on the wooden sidewalk and in the dusty street. Inside, the doctor had placed James Sullivan's coffin on the examination table normally reserved for his living patients. Present were Sheriff Ward, Reverend Pearson, Eleanor and Robert Sullivan, and Dr. Harlow himself. "I'll need to open the coffin," Dr. Harlow explained, reaching for his tools. "The glass panel doesn't allow for a proper examination." "Is that really necessary?" Robert Sullivan asked, placing a protective arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "I believe it is," Sheriff Ward answered before the doctor could respond. "There's something about Mr. Sullivan's appearance that concerns me." Eleanor Sullivan remained silent, her gaze fixed on the coffin. The interior of the doctor's office was considerably darker than the bright cemetery, and from this angle, James Sullivan's face was partially shadowed. but his open eyes were still clearly visible, staring upward with an expression that could only be described as accusatory. Dr. Harlow worked methodically to loosen the screws securing the coffin lid. "I want to emphasize that there's likely a perfectly natural explanation for what we're seeing," he said as he worked. "Post-mortem changes can sometimes create unusual effects." "Such as marks appearing on the neck days after death?" Sheriff Ward asked pointedly. Dr. Harlow's hands stilled for a moment. "That would be less common," he admitted. Robert Sullivan frowned. "What marks are you referring to, Sheriff?" "There appears to be some discoloration at the edge of Mr. Sullivan's collar," Ward explained. "I don't recall seeing it when I first viewed the body at your brother's home." Eleanor Sullivan abruptly sat down in the chair by the doctor's desk, her hand pressing against her heart. "This is unbearable," she whispered. "It won't be much longer, Eleanor," Robert assured her, "and then we can proceed with the burial as planned." Dr. Harlow removed the last screw and, with the help of Sheriff Ward, carefully lifted the coffin lid, including its glass panel. The sweet, sour smell of death and chemical preservatives filled the small office, causing Reverend Pearson to press a handkerchief to his nose. The doctor leaned forward to examine James Sullivan's face, paying particular attention to the eyes. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The eyes are indeed open, but I distinctly remember closing them during the preparation process." "Could they have opened naturally?" Robert Sullivan asked. "It's not impossible," Dr. Harlow conceded, "though it is unusual, especially given the embalming process." Sheriff Ward pointed to the edge of Sullivan's collar. "And what about that, Doctor?" Dr. Harlow carefully folded back the collar of the burial suit to reveal a series of small, dark bruises encircling James Sullivan's neck, bruises that had been concealed by the high collar of his burial clothes. "Good Lord," Reverend Pearson breathed. "Those are finger marks," Sheriff Ward said flatly. "James Sullivan was strangled." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Eleanor Sullivan's shaky breathing. Robert Sullivan's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. Those marks could have been caused by anything, perhaps during the movement of the body." Dr. Harlow was examining the bruises more closely. "No," he said slowly. "These are consistent with manual strangulation, and given their coloration, they were inflicted at or near the time of death." He looked up, his expression troubled. "I should have discovered this during my initial examination. I can only assume the lighting was poor, and I was not looking for signs of violence given the circumstances of his death." Sheriff Ward turned to Eleanor Sullivan, who sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of shock. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said gently, "I need to ask you some questions about the night your husband died." "Now?" Robert interjected. "She's clearly distraught. Surely this can wait until after the burial." "I'm afraid it can't," Sheriff Ward replied firmly. "What we have here changes everything. This is no longer a natural death, but a potential murder." Eleanor Sullivan raised her eyes to meet the sheriff's gaze. "I understand," she said with surprising composure. "What do you need to know?" "Perhaps we should speak privately," Sheriff Ward suggested, glancing at Robert Sullivan. "My brother-in-law stays," Eleanor said firmly. "I have nothing to hide from him." Sheriff Ward nodded slowly. "Very well. Please tell me about the night your husband died. You found him in the morning, correct?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. James had been working late in his study, which was not unusual. He often kept the ledgers for the store at home. I went to bed around 10 o'clock. When I woke in the morning, he wasn't beside me. I assumed he had risen early, but when I went downstairs, I found him in his study, slumped over his desk. Her voice trembled slightly. At first, I thought he was asleep, but when I touched his shoulder, he was cold. Did you notice the marks on his neck then? Eleanor shook her head. No. As the doctor said, the lighting was poor, and I was not thinking clearly. Was there anyone else in the house that night? Sheriff Ward continued. No, just James and myself. We have no children, as you know, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Grayson, doesn't live in. And you heard nothing during the night? No disturbance, no sounds of a struggle? Eleanor hesitated, a fleeting expression of uncertainty crossing her face. I sleep quite soundly. If there was any noise, I didn't hear it. Robert Sullivan shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Sheriff, I think that's enough for now. My sister-in-law is clearly exhausted by this ordeal. Dr. Harlow had continued his examination of the body while they talked. There's something else, he said suddenly, his voice sharp with surprise. Look at this. He had opened James Sullivan's right hand, which had been positioned over his chest in the coffin. Nestled in the palm was a small folded piece of paper that had been concealed by the closed fingers. What in heaven's name? Reverend Pearson murmured. Sheriff Ward carefully extracted the paper and unfolded it. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read the contents. What does it say? Robert Sullivan demanded. Ward looked up, his eyes moving from Robert to Eleanor. It's a note, apparently written by James Sullivan himself. He cleared his throat and read aloud. If you are reading this, I am dead by foul means, not natural ones, as it will surely appear. Look to those closest to me for the hand that ended my life. The truth lies in the ledgers. All eyes turned to Eleanor Sullivan, whose face had gone completely white. But it was Robert Sullivan who spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's preposterous. My brother would never write such a thing. This is clearly a forgery. Someone is attempting to cast suspicion where none should exist. Sheriff Ward refolded the note carefully. Perhaps. But it raises questions that need answers. He turned to Dr. Harlow. Doctor, I'm going to need a complete examination of the body, and the burial will have to be postponed indefinitely. You can't do that, Eleanor Sullivan said, rising from her chair with sudden energy. My husband deserves to rest in peace. I'm afraid I have no choice, Mrs. Sullivan. This is now a murder investigation. Robert Sullivan placed himself between the sheriff and his sister-in-law. This is absurd. There's no proof that note is genuine. James suffered from heart troubles. Everyone in town knew that. He likely died from natural causes, and these so-called marks on his neck could have occurred during the handling of his body. Dr. Harlow shook his head. The pattern of bruising is quite specific, Mr. Sullivan. I've seen similar marks during my time as an army surgeon. These were inflicted by human hands with considerable force. Sheriff Ward addressed Eleanor directly. Mrs. Sullivan, you mentioned ledgers. Your husband kept financial records at home? Eleanor seemed to struggle for composure. Yes, for the store. He was very meticulous about it. I'll need to see those ledgers. They're private business records, Robert Sullivan interjected. You have no right. I have every right when investigating a potential murder, Mr. Sullivan. The sheriff cut him off. Now, Mrs. Sullivan, where would I find these ledgers? Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. In his study. The cabinet behind his desk. Sheriff Ward nodded. Thank you. I'll send Deputy Collins to collect them. He turned to Dr. Harlow. Doctor, I trust you can secure the body until we get to the bottom of this? Of course, Sheriff, Dr. Harlow agreed. This is outrageous, Robert Sullivan fumed. My brother was a respected businessman, not some criminal with secrets worth killing for. Sheriff Ward's expression was impassive. In my experience, Mr. Sullivan, it's often the most respected citizens who harbor the deepest secrets. He turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Sullivan, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't leave town for the time being. I'll have more questions for you once I've examined those ledgers. Eleanor nodded mutely, her earlier composure crumbling visibly. As they prepared to leave the doctor's office, Sheriff Ward held the door open for Eleanor Sullivan. As she passed him, he said quietly, One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan. The glass panel in the coffin. Was that your idea? Eleanor paused, her eyes meeting his for a brief, electric moment. No, Sheriff, she replied softly. It was James's request. In his will. He said he always wanted to keep an eye on things, even in death. A ghost of a smile touched her lips before vanishing. How strange that his wish should prove so prophetic. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the sheriff's office as Ward spread the Sullivan ledgers across his desk. Deputy Collins sat nearby, his youthful face serious as he watched his superior flip through page after page of meticulously recorded transactions. "Anything stand out, Sheriff?" Collins asked after nearly an hour of silence. Ward rubbed his eyes. Sullivan was certainly thorough, every penny accounted for, every transaction recorded in detail. He tapped one of the ledgers with his finger. "But there are irregularities in the most recent book. Large sums moving in and out, more money than a general store in a town this size would typically handle." Collins leaned forward. "You thinking embezzlement, gambling debts?" "I'm not sure yet, but look here." Ward pointed to a recurring entry labeled simply RS Investment. "These payments to RS have been increasing steadily over the past 6 months. Started small, but the last one, just a week before Sullivan died, was for $500. RS, Collins repeated. "Robert Sullivan?" "That would be my guess. And $500 is a substantial sum, enough to raise questions about what kind of investment required that kind of money." The door to the sheriff's office opened, and both men looked up to see Martha Miller standing there, her expression hesitant. "Mrs. Miller," Ward greeted her. "What can I do for you?" Martha Miller was the wife of the town's barber, and, more significantly in a small community like Sagebrush Creek, the center of the town's unofficial information network. Little happened in Sagebrush Creek that escaped Martha's notice. "I heard about what happened at the funeral, Sheriff," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "About James Sullivan being murdered." "News travels fast," Ward commented dryly. "Though I don't recall making an official announcement to that effect." Martha had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Dr. Harlow's office isn't exactly soundproof, Sheriff, and his assistant, young Tommy Fletcher, has quite the loose tongue when pressed." Ward sighed. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Miller? I'm in the middle of an investigation." Martha straightened her back. "I have information that might be relevant to your investigation, Sheriff. Information about James Sullivan and his domestic situation." Ward gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit down and tell me what you know." Martha settled herself primly on the edge of the chair. "It's about Eleanor and Robert Sullivan," she began. "I've seen things, Sheriff. Things that a respectable married woman shouldn't be doing with her husband's brother." Ward's expression remained neutral, but his interest was piqued. "What sort of things, Mrs. Miller?" "Meetings. Secret meetings at the Bridgewater Hotel whenever Robert came to town on business. He visits from Denver every month or so, supposedly for the Mercantile Suppliers Convention. But I've seen Eleanor slipping into his room at the hotel when James was busy at the store." Martha leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the fact that they were alone in the office. "And there's more. 2 months ago, I was at the post office when a letter arrived for Eleanor. The postmaster mistakenly put it in my box, and I saw the return address before I returned it. It was from a bank in Denver, addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, personal and confidential. That hardly seems incriminating, Mrs. Miller. People receive bank correspondence all the time." Martha shook her head impatiently. "You don't understand, Sheriff. Eleanor doesn't have business in Denver, and when I handed her the letter and mentioned it was from a Denver bank, she looked positively stricken, snatched it from my hand and hurried away without so much as a thank you." Ward considered this information. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Sullivan and her brother-in-law were having an affair?" "I'm suggesting," Martha said carefully, "that there was something between them that they didn't want James to know about. Something worth killing for, perhaps." "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Miller." "These are serious times, Sheriff. A man has been murdered in our town. If what I've seen can help bring his killer to justice, I consider it my Christian duty to speak up." Ward nodded slowly. "I appreciate your coming forward. Is there anything else you think I should know?" Martha hesitated, then reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's one more thing. About a month ago, I was in Sullivan's store when James and Robert had an argument in the storeroom. They didn't know I could hear them, but voices carry in that old building. Robert was demanding money, a lot of money from the sound of it. Said something about an investment opportunity that couldn't wait. James refused, said he'd already given Robert more than enough, and that the store couldn't sustain such large withdrawals. Robert got angry, said James owed him for something that happened years ago back east. She handed the paper to Ward. I wrote down what I could remember of the conversation as soon as I got home. I keep a journal, you see. Ward unfolded the paper and scanned the contents, a detailed transcription of the overheard argument, including a threat from Robert that he would expose everything if James didn't continue the payments. This is very helpful, Mrs. Miller. I may need to speak with you again as the investigation continues. Martha stood, smoothing her skirt. I'm always happy to assist the law, Sheriff. I just hope you find whoever did this terrible thing. James Sullivan didn't deserve to die like that, whatever his faults might have been. After Martha Miller left, Deputy Collins whistled softly. Sounds like Robert Sullivan had a strong motive, Sheriff. Money problems, possibly an affair with his brother's wife. It does look that way, Ward agreed. But I've learned not to jump to conclusions too quickly. Let's keep digging through these ledgers and see what else we can find. As the afternoon wore on, Ward discovered more troubling entries in the Sullivan ledgers. A separate account book, hidden behind the others in the cabinet, revealed a pattern of significant financial irregularities. James Sullivan appeared to have been withdrawing large sums from the store's accounts and depositing them into a separate account under his own name, not the store's business account. This is odd, Ward muttered, comparing entries between the books. It looks like Sullivan was siphoning off profits from the store, but there's no record of where that money ultimately went. Deputy Collins looked up from the papers he was examining. Maybe he had gambling debts, or investments gone bad? Possibly, but the transfers were too systematic for gambling losses. This looks more like Sullivan was deliberately hiding money, either from someone else or for some purpose he wanted to keep secret. The door opened again, this time admitting Reverend Pearson. The minister looked troubled, his normally serene expression replaced by one of deep concern. Sheriff Ward, I need to speak with you, he said without preamble. About James Sullivan. Ward gestured to a chair. Seems everyone in town suddenly has something to say about the deceased, Reverend. Please, join the conversation. Pearson sat down heavily. I've been wrestling with my conscience since the discovery this morning. There's something you should know, something that may be relevant to your investigation. It concerns a confession James made to me 3 days before his death. Ward's eyebrows rose. A confession? I was under the impression that Methodists don't practice formal confession like Catholics. We don't, Pearson confirmed. But sometimes people need to unburden themselves to someone who is bound by pastoral confidence. James came to me in great distress, saying he feared for his life. Did he say who he feared? Pearson hesitated. He didn't name anyone specifically, but he said the life he'd built in Sagebrush Creek was based on a lie, and that the truth was about to come out. He said he'd been paying to keep that truth buried for years, but he could no longer afford the payments. When I pressed him for details, he became evasive, said it was better I didn't know for my own safety. Ward leaned forward. Did he give you any indication of what this truth might be? Anything that could help us understand why someone might want him dead? He mentioned his time back east before coming west. Said there had been an incident, his word, not mine, that had forced him and Eleanor to leave their home and start fresh in the Arizona territory. When I asked if Eleanor was involved in this incident, he became agitated. Said Eleanor knew nothing about it and that protecting her from the truth had been his life's work. Ward exchanged a glance with Deputy Collins. This new information complicated the emerging picture of James Sullivan's murder. If Sullivan had been hiding something from his past, something worth paying to keep secret, it introduced a whole new range of potential motives and suspects. Thank you for coming forward, Reverend, Ward said finally. I know sharing this information couldn't have been an easy decision, given the confidential nature of your conversation with Sullivan. Pearson nodded gravely. Under normal circumstances, I would take what was shared with me to my grave. But these are not normal circumstances. A man has been murdered, and if what James told me can help bring his killer to justice, then I believe God would want me to speak. As Reverend Pearson was leaving, Dr. Harlow arrived, his face grim. "Sheriff, I've completed a more thorough examination of James Sullivan's body," he announced. "There's something you need to see." Ward rose from his desk. "What is it, doctor?" "It's better if you come to my office. I don't think this is something that should be discussed publicly." Ward nodded. "Collins, keep going through these ledgers. Look especially for any references to Robert Sullivan or to events back east before the Sullivans came to Arizona." The walk to Dr. Harlow's office was conducted in silence, the doctor refusing to elaborate on his findings until they were behind closed doors. Inside, James Sullivan's body lay on the examination table, now fully removed from the coffin. The body had been partially undressed, the burial suit jacket and shirt carefully folded nearby. "Look at this," Dr. Harlow said, pointing to Sullivan's right forearm. There, clearly visible against the pale skin, was a faded but distinct tattoo, the kind common among sailors and soldiers. It depicted an eagle with spread wings, clutching a banner in its talons that read 7th NY. "The 7th New York Volunteer Infantry," Ward murmured. "Sullivan served in the war." "Yes, but that's not the significant part," Dr. Harlow replied. "Look at the name inscribed below the regimental designation." Ward leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he made out the faded letters. "Sergeant William Hargrove." "William Hargrove," Ward repeated slowly. "Not James Sullivan." "Exactly," Dr. Harlow said grimly. "Our respected shopkeeper appears to have been living under a false identity. And there's more." He moved to his desk and picked up a telegram form. "After I discovered the tattoo, I sent an urgent telegram to a colleague in New York who has connections with the Military Records Office. He responded an hour ago." He handed the telegram to Ward. The sheriff read it quickly, his expression darkening. "William Hargrove, Sergeant, 7th New York. Wanted for the murder of a superior officer in 1865. Deserted before court-martial. Never apprehended." He looked up at Dr. Harlow. "Our victim was a fugitive." "It would appear so," the doctor agreed. "And it raises a troubling question. Who knew his true identity? Was he killed because someone discovered who he really was? Or was his past finally catching up with him in some other way?" Ward paced the small office, his mind racing. This changes everything. If Sullivan or Hargrove was hiding from a murder charge, he'd have been desperate to keep his true identity secret. The payments to Robert Sullivan in the ledgers. Could Robert have discovered the truth and been blackmailing his brother? "It's certainly possible," Dr. Harlow acknowledged. "But it doesn't explain Eleanor's role in all this. Did she know her husband was living under a false name? Was she complicit in his deception?" Ward stopped pacing and turned to face the doctor. "There's one way to find out. I need to question both of them again, separately this time, and I think I'll start with Robert Sullivan. Have you ever wondered what secrets your own ancestors might have been hiding? Leave a comment saying, 'The truth always rises to the surface.' If you believe that no matter how deeply we try to bury the past, it eventually finds a way to reveal itself." Robert Sullivan was staying at the Bridgewater Hotel, the only establishment in Sagebrush Creek that could reasonably be called a hotel rather than a simple boarding house. When Sheriff Ward arrived, he found Robert in the small dining room, nursing a glass of whiskey despite the early hour. "Mr. Sullivan," Ward said, approaching the table, "I need to speak with you." Robert looked up, his face haggard. "Have you come to arrest me, Sheriff? Martha Miller has been busy spreading her poisonous speculations around town. I've already had the hotel owner ask me discreetly when I'll be checking out, as if I were some kind of criminal." "I'm not here to arrest you, Mr. Sullivan, just to ask some questions." Robert gestured to the empty chair across from him. "By all means, then, ask your questions, though I'd appreciate it if we could speak somewhere more private than the hotel dining room." Ward nodded. "Your room would be suitable." Robert led the way upstairs to a modestly appointed room on the second floor. Once inside, he poured another drink from a bottle on the dresser without offering one to the sheriff. "What's this about, Ward?" I've told you everything I know about my brother's death." "Have you?" Ward asked quietly. "I don't think you have, Mr. Sullivan. In fact, I think you've been less than forthcoming about several matters. Let's start with the payments your brother was making to you, the ones recorded in his ledger as RS Investment." Robert's expression hardened, but he didn't appear surprised. "Business between brothers is hardly a criminal matter, Sheriff. It becomes my concern when one of those brothers ends up strangled in his study. The ledgers show increasing payments to you over the past 6 months, $500 in the last payment alone. That's a lot of money for an investment." Robert took a long drink, then set his glass down with deliberate care. "James was helping me with a business venture in Denver. I've had some financial setbacks recently. He was being a good brother, that's all." "A good brother," Ward repeated skeptically. "Yet witnesses overheard you arguing with him about these payments. You threatened to expose everything if he stopped paying. That sounds more like blackmail than brotherly assistance, Mr. Sullivan." Robert's face flushed with anger. Eavesdroppers rarely hear good of themselves, or the truth about others. Whatever Martha Miller thinks she heard was taken out of context. "Then provide the context for me," Ward pressed. "What exactly were you threatening to expose?" For a long moment, Robert remained silent, studying his empty glass. Finally, he sighed and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "It's not what you think, Sheriff. I wasn't blackmailing James over anything he'd done. I was trying to protect him and Eleanor from the consequences of his past." "His past as William Hargrove, you mean?" The color drained from Robert's face. "How did you—" "The tattoo on his arm. Not something a man can easily hide from his doctor during a thorough post-mortem examination." Robert closed his eyes briefly. Yes, his past as William Hargrove. A past he'd been running from for 17 years. "Tell me everything, Mr. Sullivan. Starting with when you learned your brother wasn't who he claimed to be." Robert poured himself another drink before beginning. "James, William, was my half-brother. Same mother, different fathers. He was 10 years older than me. When the war broke out, he enlisted in the 7th New York, rose to the rank of sergeant. He wrote home regularly at first, but then the letters stopped. A year later, we received official notification that he was wanted for the murder of his commanding officer and had deserted before he could be court-martialed. And you didn't hear from him again? Not for years. Our mother died believing her eldest son was a murderer and a fugitive. Then, in 1873, I received a letter postmarked from St. Louis. It was from William, but he was calling himself James Sullivan by then. He told me he'd established himself in business out west, had married a respectable woman, who Robert took a long breath before continuing. William had not actually murdered his commanding officer. The man was corrupt, stealing supplies meant for the troops and selling them on the black market. William confronted him, and they fought. The officer fell and hit his head, an accident, not murder. But with the chaos of war and the officer's connections, William knew he'd never get a fair hearing. So he ran. And became James Sullivan, Ward concluded. Yes, he created a new identity, moved west where people didn't ask too many questions, and eventually met Eleanor. She knew nothing of his past. He wanted to protect her from it. So what changed? Why was he suddenly paying you large sums of money? Robert's shoulders slumped. A former soldier from his regiment recognized him in Denver last year when James was there on business. The man approached me instead of James directly, thinking he could get money more discreetly. He threatened to report James to the authorities if I didn't pay him regularly. So the payments in the ledger were going to this blackmailer, not to me. I was just the intermediary. But the demands kept increasing. James was draining his business to keep this secret. A week before he died, he told me he couldn't pay anymore. The store was nearly bankrupt. He was going to turn himself in rather than continue living a lie. Sheriff Ward studied Robert carefully. That's quite a story, Mr. Sullivan, but it doesn't explain who killed your brother. I don't know who killed him, Robert insisted, but I suspect it might have been the blackmailer. Perhaps James confronted him, refused to pay anymore, and things got violent. Do you have a name for this blackmailer? Edward Crane, former corporal in the 7th New York. He owns a saloon in Denver now. Ward made a note of the name. One last question. Does Eleanor know any of this? Robert hesitated. No, at least James never told her. He wanted to spare her the shame. I've been trying to protect her too since his death. I see, Ward said, rising to his feet. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Sullivan. Please don't leave town just yet. Eleanor Sullivan sat alone in the parlor of the house she had shared with James, staring at a daguerreotype of their wedding day. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room when Sheriff Ward knocked at her door. Mrs. Sullivan, he said when she admitted him, I apologize for disturbing you again, but there are new developments in the case. You found who killed James? She asked, her voice hollow. Not yet, but I've discovered something about your husband that you should know. Ward chose his words carefully. The man you knew as James Sullivan was living under an assumed identity. His real name was William Hargrove. Eleanor's reaction was not what Ward expected. There was no shock, no disbelief, only a deep, weary resignation in her eyes. You found the tattoo, she said quietly. Ward's surprise must have shown on his face, for Eleanor gave him a sad smile. I've known who my husband really was for nearly 5 years, Sheriff. He told me himself one night after too much whiskey. About the officer he accidentally killed, about his flight west, about creating James Sullivan from nothing. Yet you stayed with him. I loved him, Eleanor said simply. The name didn't matter to me. The man did. Did you know about the blackmailer? The reason for the payments to Robert? Eleanor's expression darkened. There was no blackmailer, Sheriff. That's a lie Robert told you to protect himself. She moved to a small secretary desk in the corner of the parlor and removed a key from around her neck. These are James's private letters, the ones he didn't keep at the store. They tell a different story. She unlocked a drawer and handed Ward a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Robert has been embezzling from the Denver branch of Sullivan's Mercantile for years. James discovered it 6 months ago. Robert begged for a chance to make things right, claimed he had gambling debts but could repay everything if James would just help him one last time. So, the payments in the ledger were James covering his brother's theft to avoid a scandal, but Robert kept demanding more. The night James died, Robert was here. I heard them arguing in the study. James said he was cutting Robert off, that he would report the embezzlement to the authorities if necessary. You're saying Robert killed his brother over money? Eleanor shook her head. Not just money. There was something else. Something from their past. I don't know what it was, but James had something on Robert. Some secret Robert was desperate to keep hidden. Something worse than the embezzlement. Ward examined the letters quickly, confirming Eleanor's account of the financial arrangement between the brothers. Why didn't you come forward with this information immediately? I was afraid, Eleanor admitted. Robert threatened me after James died. Said if I breathed a word about the embezzlement, he would make sure I was implicated in James's death. And without proof, who would believe me over him? The note in your husband's hand, the one we found in the coffin. Did you place it there? Yes, Eleanor whispered. It was the only way I could think of to make sure someone would look deeper into James's death. I knew the glass panel might reveal the marks on his neck if the light hit it just right during the funeral. It was a desperate gamble. Ward nodded slowly, the pieces finally fitting together. I need to find Robert. He's still at the Bridgewater Hotel? Eleanor's eyes widened in alarm. No, Sheriff. I saw him boarding the eastbound stage not 30 minutes ago. He said he had urgent business in Tucson. The telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages as Sheriff Ward coordinated with law enforcement in Tucson. Robert Sullivan was apprehended 2 days later attempting to board a train to California. The evidence against him was overwhelming. James's letters detailing the embezzlement, Eleanor's testimony about the argument the night of the murder, and finally, a confession from Robert himself when faced with the prospect of hanging. The truth, when it finally emerged, was even darker than the sheriff had imagined. Robert had indeed killed his brother over money, But the deeper secret that James held over him was that Robert had been responsible for the death of their mother years ago, a death that had been ruled an accident but was in fact a calculated murder to gain inheritance. James had discovered proof of this shortly before his death and had confronted his brother with it. 1 month after the funeral that never concluded, James Sullivan, or William Hargrove, was finally laid to rest in the Sagebrush Creek Cemetery. The glass panel remained in the coffin lid, but this time his eyes were truly at peace, the truth of his death no longer buried with him. Sheriff Ward stood beside Eleanor at the graveside as the last prayers were said. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. Eleanor gazed at the coffin as it was lowered into the ground. "Continue running the store. James built something good here despite his past. I want to honor that. And the truth about who he really was? Some truths are meant to be known," Eleanor replied. "Others serve no purpose except to cause pain. The people of Sagebrush Creek knew the man, not the name. That's what matters in the end." As the mourners dispersed, Abigail Tanner, the young girl who had first spotted James's open eyes in the coffin, placed a small bunch of wildflowers on the fresh earth. "Do you think he can see us still, through the glass?" she asked her father. The blacksmith placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "No, child, but perhaps he can rest now, knowing that the truth came to light." The glass panel that had revealed James Sullivan's final plea for justice was covered by earth and stone, but its legacy remained, a reminder that even in death, the truth refuses to stay buried. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. If this story touched you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates tales of justice from America's forgotten past. And don't forget to subscribe. There are countless more untold stories waiting to be unearthed from the shadows of history.